Hey everyone, welcome to the third video of our Google ADK series. Today, we will make our AI agent talk to real REST APIs without writing function tools manually. We will provide an OpenAPI file to the Google ADK, which will auto-generate the tools, and then we will demo it with a real API called as Chuck Norris API. And by the end, you will be able to plug in any OpenAPI file and have your agent talk to that API right away. Let's dive in. In this video, we will learn how to automatically generate tools from OpenAPI Spec file, enabling your agent to interact with REST APIs without manually writing tool functions. There are a few prerequisites. First is you need to have Python 3.9 installed. You need to have the Google API key, which you can get from Google AI Studio. And ideally, you should have completed the first two tutorials because this is the third tutorial and it builds on the first two tutorials. Now let's look at the core concepts, which will help us understand the demo better, the code better, and the concept better. Now, what is OpenAPI? OpenAPI is a machine readable and human readable specification, and it's a standard for describing the REST APIs. What does it have? It has the entire API's structure and functionality. To get an understanding of how the OpenAPI file looks and what are its contents, let's go through an example OpenAPI file, which is about a simple to-do list API. Okay, so let's look at this file. I have this file in the repository. So we look at the repository in a short while, but right now let's look at the example file. I have considered core components that you would usually see in an OpenAPI file. Okay, and I have collapsed most of the components. So we will take a top-down approach. First, we have info. Okay, first we have OpenAPI. So OpenAPI here version is 3.0.0. Now you can always refer to this file later. I have ensured that for each line item, there is a comment on what it means. So it's easy to relate when you look at it later. Now, first is OpenAPI. So that's the spec version that's used by this document. Then we have info. Info is the metadata. It's the high level information about the API. It has a title, it has a description, and it has a version. Later you can look at the explanation of each of this key. But for now, I'm just giving a quick overview. Next, we have servers. Now, server is a base URL that will be used as a prefix for all your endpoints or for all your paths. Next is the paths itself. Paths, it's like a collection of endpoints and their operations. So if I expand this to do, you will see that there are two operations inside to do. So to do is the endpoint, and these are operations for that endpoint. Get means that you're reading data, and post means that you're creating a new resource. If I expand get, which is an operation. Now, the reason why I'm explaining all this is later when we try to understand what happens under the hood, you'll be able to relate to all these terminologies or keywords. If you look at the get operation, each operation, you can think of each operation having this kind of structure. There is a summary which tells what the operation is about. You have the operation ID, which will later become the name of the function. We will look at that. Then there is responses. If I expand responses, these are the kind of responses that this endpoint for this operation gives us. Typically, you have a 200 response, which is a status code of OK, 200 OK. And then the description, again, this is the human description of the response. The content of the response, it's of the type JSON, and the schema of the JSON is you will get an array, and inside that array, the items are of the type to do schema. We have used a reference object here. So if I expand components, schemas, and to do here, components, schemas, and to do, you will see that the schema of the to do object is specified. So it is of the type JSON. It's a JSON object. It has ID, it has title, and it has completed. Okay. So when you hit to do's endpoint and you use a get operation, you will get a JSON response which has these keys or this schema. Okay. Similarly, if we look at the post operation on this endpoint, it is about creating a new to-do list. And because we are making some change or because we are creating a new resource, there is a request body which is required, and the content of the request body, which we send, or when we hit this API, we have to give a request body, a JSON, and the schema of that JSON again is referenced in this to-do input. So if I go to components and if I look at to-do input, you will see that it's a JSON object and it should have two keys, title and completed, and both of them are required. So just like we have the endpoint slash to-dos, there is another endpoint which is to-do ID, and then there are three operations for this endpoint. There is get, there is put, and there is delete. And similarly, you will see that it follows the same structure. There is summary, there is operation ID, there are parameters. And since it's a get operation, you don't send a request body, you just get a response body. So if I expand the response, there's a 200 with 200 status code, okay response, and then the response schema, JSON schema is again of to do. If you're using a put operation, which is again updating the existing resource, then you do have to send a request body and then it follows a specific schema structure. So in this way, we got a feel of how a usual OpenAPI specification looks like. What are the different keys that you will observe? So in summary, you will have info, which is the metadata. You have servers, then you have paths, which is a collection of the endpoints. Then for each of the endpoint, you have the operations that you can do on that endpoint. And then there are additional reusable components that you specify under this key components. Okay. If you just want to check if the specification is correct, then you can go to this URL where if I paste this OpenAPI spec, if there is an error, you will see an error, but for this, it works correctly. So you will see that this is kind of a documentation where it will try to parse this OpenAPI spec and show you all the possible operations and the endpoints. So if you see there is a servers, there are these operations for these endpoints, and then there are the two schemas that we have defined. Okay. Now let's get back to our core concepts. What we just saw is how an OpenAPI specification looks like. What are the possible components of the OpenAPI spec? Now, the reason why it was important is because later you will understand that each of these components plays a role when ADK converts this OpenAPI spec into tools. Why does it matter? Why are we even talking about the OpenAPI specification? The reason is because ADK can automatically turn our OpenAPI file specification into tools that our agent can directly use. So we don't have to manually define individual function tools for each API endpoint. If this functionality was not there, what we would have to do was we would have to literally convert each of those operations that we saw, right? Get, put, post, and so on. We would have to convert each of those operations into functions, literally manually, and then pass them as tools to the agent. But now because ADK has this functionality, has this feature, we just have to get hold of the OpenAPI specification file or create one if it's not available and pass it to ADK. Now we'll talk about the key components. There are majorly two key components. One is the OpenAPIToolset, and that's the primary class that we will use. What we have to do is we have to pass it the OpenAPI specification. It will automatically handle the parsing of the spec as well as generation of the tools. And then the second class is the REST API tool class. This represents a single callable API operation. So we just saw the example OpenAPI specification, right? And there were so many operations under each endpoint. Now, this REST API tool, each REST API tool instance is representative of each operation that was defined in the OpenAPI specification. So the primary class OpenAPIToolset creates one REST API tool class instance for each operation that is defined in our specification. So for example, every operation like put get gets converted into a separate tool. Now let's see what happens under the hood, because it's important for us to know what happens under the hood, right? The first step is initialization and parsing. We have to provide the OpenAPI specification to the OpenAPIToolset class, either as a Python dictionary or a JSON string or a YAML file or a YAML string. The OpenAPIToolset class then internally parses and resolves any references that are there as part of the OpenAPI spec file. The second step is discovery of operations in the paths. So we saw all those operations, right? Like get, put. It identifies all the valid API operations which are defined within the paths. The next step is a tool generation step. So tools get generated one per operation. Now the tool name is derived from the operation ID, which is there as part of the OpenAPI spec. The tool description is derived from the summary or the description. And then the API details like the HTTP method, the base URL, the parameters also get stored. The last step is the REST API tool functionality. The first functionality is schema generation. So it dynamically creates the function declaration which are based on the operations parameter and the request body. Then it's able to execute it, meaning it's able to construct the correct HTTP request and then execute an API call to that URL using the request library. And then ultimately it's also able to handle the API response. So this is what happens under the hood. This is what ADK does under the hood. Now that we have a fair bit of understanding of the core concepts, let's go to the fun part where we go into the demo. So what are we developing today? We are developing a Chuck Norris fact assistant. I'm pretty sure some of you may not know who is Chuck Norris and what is the fact assistant that we are talking about. So Chuck Norris is an American martial artist and an actor, and he's famous for funny Chuck Norris facts, which are short jokes that exaggerate his toughness and abilities. Okay, so what we'll be building is an agent that retrieves these jokes or facts from the public Chuck Norris API. There's a free API, free public Chuck Norris API. This is how the API looks. It's free, it does not require any authentication. They have a page about how to use it. If you look at the page, you will see that you can retrieve a random joke. Then you can retrieve a random joke from a given category. That's 2. Third, you can retrieve a list of available categories. And fourth, you can do a text search to get the results of the jokes or of the facts. Okay, so our agent will be able to do all those 4 things. It will be able to search for the jokes by category. It can get random jokes. It can list available categories. And then we'll be using the OpenAPIToolset class to auto-generate the tools from the OpenAPI specification. Now, why we used this API? It's because it's free. You don't need an API key because most of the official APIs require some form of authentication. You may require an API key, but this one doesn't. And it has simple operations and it's great for learning. And that's why we use this API. Okay, so now let's go to the code. Let's look at the code and at the end of it, let's see the demo. And we'll also test a few prompts to see how our agent works and how the OpenAPI specification gets converted into tools automatically. So if we look at our directory structure, right now we have an empty folder, which is Chuck-Norris-agent. Inside this folder, we'll be creating our agent. Then we have docs. Now there's a markdown file here. This file has the entire tutorial that we are covering in this video. So later for reference, you can just preview this file and it has all the information that we are covering in this video. And then there is an example OpenAPI specification file. So this is the file that we looked at. You can always refer to it. The advantage is I have ensured that each of this component has an explanation so that you know what it means for easy reference later on. By the way, though, most of the times you will not be creating this specification yourself. You would be finding these APIs in official GitHub pages or documentations of APIs, but understanding what components are there in the OpenAPI spec, it will be clear for you how this is used. Okay, so let's start our terminal and let's get started with the development. So the first step in any project is to set up a virtual environment. So let's create a virtual environment. We're calling it .venv and let's activate the virtual environment. So paste the code. So now we have activated the virtual environment. Let's install the Google ADK. I've covered these steps in the previous tutorials as well. So we'll install Google ADK package. Now we want to create the agent inside this folder. So let's go inside this folder here and I will create the agent here, ADK create Chuck Norris agent. We will select other models because we want to write the code ourselves. As usual, it created 3 files, the .env, init and agent.py. Our code will sit inside agent.py and the Google API key will be inside .env. I hope you have set up the .env file and you have pasted the Google API key there. We will now start with the code. So the first thing we will do is we will look at the OpenAPI specification for the Chuck Norris API. The Chuck Norris API doesn't publish an official OpenAPI file. We took help of ChatGPT to create one. Of course, we required a bit of tuning to make it work. So we are in the agent.py file. We have imported our typical classes that are required, and this is the new one, the primary class, which we spoke about, OpenAPIToolset. Now this is how the specification looks. I hope now that this is familiar to you because we looked at the example specification. You have those typical components, right? There is OpenAPI, there is info, you have the base URL, then there are paths. Remember, we looked at 4 different ways to use this API. Random was one, where you can get a random joke. It would respond with the schema, which is icon URL, ID, URL, and value. This is one. Then there is search. Inside search, you can give a keyword and it will fetch the results for the jokes that have the keyword. Okay, this is second. Then categories, you can get categories, you can get all the joke categories that are there. So one more thing, here you can get a joke, you can get a random joke by optionally providing a category. Okay, so if you see there's in parameters, there is name category, it will go into the search query and it is not required, it's optional. These are the 4 operations that we looked at on the website. You can see that those are referenced in our specification file. Now that we have our OpenAPI spec ready, let's move to the next step where we create the OpenAPI toolset. So this is the OpenAPI toolset class. We are specifying a JSON here, which is a Chuck Norris spec that we named here. Okay, this will create the toolset. The next step is to define the agent configuration. So let's do that. Okay, let's quickly go through it. Now, this is our agent. This is the root agent. Again, the variable has to be exactly root_agent. We have the name of the agent. We are using Gemini 2.5 Flash. This is the description. Now let's look at the instructions. You are a fun Chuck Norris fact assistant. So we have defined capabilities. We have defined the style. We have defined the workflow. The workflow is quite important here. So for random requests, use the get random joke. Now, do not get confused. You would be asking, where are these names coming from? These names are coming from the operation ID of each operation within an endpoint. Okay, for example, if we look at where get random joke comes, you will see that it is under the endpoint random under the operation get, and the operation ID component gets used as the actual function tool name. Okay, and that's the reason why in the instructions we are using this name, the operation ID. So for random requests, use this tool. For specific topics, use this tool, and so on. So depending on the scenario or the user intent, we are asking the agent to use relevant tools. And then there is some parsing element where the value field from the API response is the actual joke. So you can go through this instruction later on. I just want to highlight the sections that we have and what is included in those sections. And the most important part is this tool set. So OpenAPI toolset we looked at previously, right? It's able to convert all the operations into individual tools. And now we just have to pass this toolset inside tools, and the agent will get access to all those tools, which are nothing but the operations for the endpoints in the API. Okay. So we are actually done. This is all we had to do. Now again, an important note is, because the Chuck Norris API did not have an official OpenAPI specification, we actually ended up creating one. But in real world use cases, if you create the custom API, if it is your API, maybe you created using Fast API, then you would be automatically be able to get the documentation and OpenAPI specification if you have developed it. If it is an official API, you should get the OpenAPI specification in their documentation or in their GitHub page. In worst case scenarios, you may have to create the specification yourself, like we did for this Chuck Norris API. Great. Now we can actually spin the local development server and try a few prompts and see if it's able to do its job. Okay, so the command for starting the local development server is ADK web. This should start our local dev UI. So we've seen this UI a couple of times now in the previous tutorials. So I'll probably just get started with the prompts. So let's try a few prompts now. You will find these prompts in the documentation, in the code base. So first we will try to get a random joke. So let's try that. So the query is, tell me a random Chuck Norris joke. Now let's see what it responds. Now you see that in the events or in the trace, you will see that we have discussed this process at length in the previous tutorials, so you can check it out if you have not. But you see that it was correctly able to call the get random joke tool. Again, we have not defined this tool ourselves. ADK extracted and created a custom tool using the OpenAPI specification. Okay, so we requested for a random joke and it was able to call the tool get random joke, and it was successfully able to fetch a response from the API, which then gave us a random joke. The joke looks like a robber pulled a gun on Chuck Norris asked, and so on, right? So it's pretty long, so I won't read it. Now, what happened was the agent called the get random joke tool without any category. So remember that this tool does accepts an optional category, but in this case, we did not provide it. The API returned a JSON with the joke in the value field. The agent then extracted that and it formatted the joke and then it gave it to us. So if you see the events, and if I go to function execution, okay, here is the function. The third event is the function response. Now you will see that the response of the API looks like this. There is created at, there is icon URL, there is ID, it's updated at URL and value. And this is what we looked at inside the OpenAPI specification under the response body, under the schema of the response body. Now let's look at another prompt. This time we will search by keyword. We will search a joke by keyword. So I'm going to type find jokes about programming. Now what it should do is it should call another tool, which is search jokes with a specific query. So let's see. Great. So now you see that it was able to call the tool search underscore jokes. And then it was able to return a joke saying Chuck Norris insists on strongly typed programming languages. Of course he does. Chuck Norris demands precision in everything, especially his code. I'm not sure this is a joke that's worth laughing, but we are trying to understand the functionality. Okay. So here it correctly called the search jokes tool because we just gave a query. We just gave a keyword programming and we expected it to return a joke which is about programming, and which it did correctly. The next prompt is, so we'll try to list the categories that are available for us. And then in the subsequent prompt, we will try to get a random joke by providing that optional category. So let's see what categories are available and let's see what tool it calls. Great. So it correctly called the tool get categories, and these are the categories that are available, which we can search. For these categories, there are jokes or facts. Okay. Now let's look at the final prompt where we'll try to get a random joke by providing a category. So here I will be providing a dev category in the user query. So tell me a joke from the dev category, and what it should do is it should call the get random joke tool again, but this time with the category dev. Okay, let's see if it does. So it did call get random joke, and you see that this was a function call by the LLM, which said that the ADK should execute this tool, which is get random joke, with the category dev, and this is the parameter. It correctly did a function call, right, with this category, and it got a response like this, and this is our joke or fact that you see here. So this is how ADK does a great job of converting the OpenAPI specification into actual tools, and it takes care of everything under the hood. So the key takeaways for this tutorial is OpenAPI-Toolset class is actually equal to 0 manual tool code, because we actually defined 0 manual function tools, right? We didn't code anything. So there was no need to manually write each of those function tools like search jokes. We didn't have to write it. The operation ID became the function name, and that controls how the LLM sees the tool. And we then use this function name in our instruction where we told the agent what tool is there and how to use it. The parameters that are there inside the spec become the arguments of the function. So they become the tool function signature. And the best part is this works with any OpenAPI API where there is a specification available. Great. So we have come to the end of the video. I hope this was helpful. So we covered what an OpenAPI specification is, what are the different components. I believe that you are at least a bit more comfortable in understanding what OpenAPI specification file looks like, what are the usual common components, and how ADK graciously converts this spec file into tools and how the agent is able to automatically use those tools. Thank you for watching the video. If you found this video helpful, please like, please subscribe, and stay tuned because we are going to come up with many more tutorials and we are going to ultimately become experts at creating agents using ADK and as well as other tools. Signing off.